From Anshe Sfard Bethel Emeth Congregation, it's time to take 10 minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of Parshat Toledot. How old was Rivka when she got married? Those of us who are familiar with Rashi and the Midrashim are familiar with the notion that Rivka, when she was found by Eliezer, servant of Abraham, she was 3 years old. And many people may have found this bizarre. And then in this week's Parsha, when she gets married, she's 3 years old. Is there an alternative? And if there isn't, why do the rabbis suggest this idea? In terms of why we would assume that she was 3, it's a simple calculation. If we assume that the Parshiot, the various sections, are described in order, so then in Parshat Vayera, we had the binding of Isaac, the Akedah Yitzchak, and then word that Rivka was born, and it's assumed that the next section, which records the death of Sarah, is a result of the binding of Isaac. She hears that Isaac dies, Isaac is sacrificed, and she passes away. So therefore, when she passed away, she was 127 years old. Isaac was born when she was 90, and therefore he was 37 when the binding took place. And if it says in this week's Parshat Toledot, that he was 40 years old when he got married, then Rivka, who was born at the very end of the binding of Isaac, when Isaac was 37, well, now if he's 40, then she must be 3. Why that is, we'll leave for the end of our discussion. But first, an alternative version. Firstly, the very notion that these stories, as they line up in Parshat Vayera and Parshat Chayesara, that somehow that tells us the chronology, this is questioned by a number of commentaries. Ibn Ezra believes that indeed Yitzchak was a younger man, referred to as Bini, my son, my son. He seems to ask naive questions. He assumes he's around 13. If you can believe the evidence of the reportage of Reb Avraham, the son of the Rambam also did not like the idea that Yitzchak was so old at the binding of Isaac. He says he was probably much younger. In fact, the word na'ar, which is used in the story of the binding of Isaac, is often associated with someone who is 15, 17, and the like. So in fact, there is another version, and it's supported by the Sator Olam, a Gaonic work, talks about chronology, and it assumes that actually she was 14 when she was married. Now, how does this calculation work out? Well, it's also based on a Sifri, another Midrash, that says that 3 people that we know, they died at 133 years old. Rivka, Kahat, that's one of the sons of Levi, and also Ben Azai, one of the great rabbis, friend of Rabbi Akiva. 133. Why 133? Well, if indeed she was 3 when she was married, and then 20 years later she had children, and then 63 years later the blessings were stolen and given, and then 14 years took place where Yaakov was studying in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. 20 years were spent in Laban's house, 1.5 years at Sukkot, a half a year in Beit El, and we come to a grand total, well, that's only 122. And she's supposed to be 133. So we're missing 11 years. So instead of saying that she's 3, let's say she was 14. So in fact, the Sifri, claiming that she died at 133, seems to agree with the Sator Olam that indeed she was 14. She was 14 when she married. Now this does create its own problems, because if she was only 3, we understand why they didn't take drastic measures. They didn't start praying in this special kind of way until 20 years into the marriage. Usually after 10 years, there's a certain panic that sets in. The Gemara in Yevamos, the Mishnah in Yevamos, page 64a, says that after 10 years, there are issues that can be raised regarding a marriage after 10 years where there are no children. And they based it on Avraham, and a verse relating to Avraham. And there they ask the question, well, what about Yitzchak? Why don't you learn from Yitzchak? It took 20 years for them to really raise a concern and issue. So the Moshav Zakenim, a collection of Tosfot, he says, wait a second. Why are they asking to learn from Yitzchak? Maybe Yitzchak wasn't concerned for the first 10 years because she was underage. She wasn't even bat mitzvah yet. Why should he be concerned about not having children between the age of 3 and 13? That wasn't really fully a marriage. And they were only concerned from the time of 13 until 23. That was a concern. Why did they have no children? After 10 years of her being of maturity, then the question was, why wasn't she having any children? But if we say that she was married at 14, then why did they wait 20 years? Why did they wait 20 years? The Moshe Zakenim doesn't have any question, any answer to it. We'll have to get back to that later. Now, some other questions that arise are, it does say, after all, it does seem to say that after the binding of Isaac, which we assume was 37, let's stick with that. If he was 37 and he just hears that she was born, that Rivka was born, then I guess she was just 3 when he got married at 40. The answer could be that when you get news in those days particularly, who says it's news that she was born? Maybe it's news that she's marriageable. Maybe it's news that she's just 11 years old. And therefore, they get married 3 years later, because Yitzchak goes off into the Gan Eden, he goes off into his own world, he goes to Be'er Lachai Roi, a place of spirituality, he goes away, and 3 years later, she's 14. And now what about the water? How could she carry so much water if she's only 3? So the one answer is given in the Das Zakenim by Tosfos. I'm sorry, it's mentioned in the Midrash Seichel Tov in the Torah Shlema footnote. He mentions that in those days, maybe a girl of 3 had the capability today of a girl of 10, and she was indeed able to carry all that. The Ramban, the commentators on the Gemara, do say that they endorse this notion of the 14 for various halachic reasons, and they say that in fact it does call her a na'ara, which usually implies that she's 12, but maybe she hadn't matured yet. She's only until she was 14, and indeed they endorse the notion that she married at 14. So, is that the only tradition that she married at the age of 3? No, there is another tradition as well, another rabbinic tradition, midrashic tradition, that she was indeed 14 at the time of the marriage. Now, why would the rabbis say that she was 3? Why would there be some midrashic tradition that she was 3? What is that all about? Assuming that's a fact and a historical tradition, that's just the way it is. But indeed, if there were other options, why would the rabbis maintain that and also make Isaac 37? They wanted Isaac to be 37 because they want the Akedah to be a volitional act, an act taken out of Isaac's own volition. And they wanted Rivka to be 3 because they wanted her to be pure. Now, if you ask, why did they want her to be pure? What about Rachel and Leah? They didn't make them 3. Rachel and Leah also came into the family from the non-Jewish pagan culture. Didn't we want to make them out to be so pure and make them 3? Apparently, there's some notion that when it comes to Isaac is like a Kohen Gadol. He's a priest. He must marry a virgin. He must marry a young bride, and therefore his bride has to be special. Also, one more thing, and that is that according to the other midrash, that indeed she was 14, and after 10 years they didn't panic, and they only waited 20 years till they prayed. This is a testament to the special marriage of Rivka and Yitzchak. Their marriage was unlike any of the other marriages in Bereshit and in Torah. Here, he's praying for her, she's praying for him. It's a beautiful image of two people who, until 20 years, they weren't even concerned. They just stuck to each other. There were no concubines who came into the relationship. There were no mandrakes that were brought in. These are two people devoted to God, devoted to each other. They're inseparable. There are issues in their marriage, the Netziv, others raise issues of how they relate to each other exactly, but they are bound and committed to each other in a remarkable fashion. And it took 20 years till they really began to worry, and it was only then they began to pray. Two different visions of the story of Yitzchak and Rivka. There are alternatives, there are different views, but perhaps this is a testament to the purity of one of our matriarchs, of Rivka, and the beauty and the steadfastness of the marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka, dedicated for 20 years, no children, committed to each other forever, and they just turned to God for additional assistance. Thanks you for joining us here at the Anshe Sfar Beth Lamed congregation for our discussion of Yitzchak and Rivka. Join us each week for our discussion of the Parsha and other discussions as well. Thanks to Jason Lefkowitz for his technical assistance. Thank you.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein. To learn more, visit ASBEE.org.